So today I'm going to show you guys a slowed down version of trimming and dry brining a brisket. This is going to be a long video. I'm going to answer a lot of questions that I always get when I post something about dry brining a brisket. Let's get into it. So before we get started, I like to use a boning knife to trim my brisket. Now, whatever knife you are most comfortable with, you can use that. There's no rule, but I am comfortable using this boning knife most times, and this one is a little bit more stiff. This one has a little bit more bend to it. So for thicker cuts, I will use this one. For just the basic trimming and everything else, I'll use this. For dry brining, you want to use a sheet like this and a rack so that you're giving enough air around the brisket. You can use kosher salt to do the dry brining, or you can use your whole rub. This is my homemade SPG that I use on most of my beef. So if you use just the salt after the dry brining and you're ready to cook, you would just add other ingredients that doesn't include salt. So if you want something for color, if you want a different flavor, that's different, but do not add any more salt. This is a 21.2 pounds brisket, big bitch. I like to cut on the fat cap because I don't care if there's a gash in the fat cap, but I don't like when there's a gash on the meat side. So you want to keep the bag kind of intact. That way you can lift the brisket out and leave the bag right down there. Now we have all that meat juice in the bag. We're just gonna do like so. Everything is in the bag. You don't make too big of a mess on your cutting board. The very first thing I like to do, remove the mohawk. It doesn't really matter on the point if you got the meat exposed because there's so much fat content in here that's not going to hurt it. I'm going for all the thick chunks of fat. You can remove this fat down here on the flat or not. It doesn't hurt anything. This is the decal. I do not dig into the decal, but I like to square the decal up with the brisket. Now the decal is the big chunk of fat that separates the two muscles, the point and the flat. So if you wanted to separate the fat and the point, like you wanted to use a piece for corned beef and the other piece for pastrami, then that's where you would go in and it would just separate out and you would follow the fat seam all the way down. I'm just gonna take a big chunk here. So I'm gonna go get the bigger knife or the stiffer blade. You can see the fat seam right there. That's where the two muscles separate. That part right there, I want to get rid of this because this is a gristly piece. That doesn't taste good even at the end of the cook. I don't allow my briskets to fly through my smoker, so I'm not trying to make it aerodynamic. I'm just trying to make it look satisfactory to me. And we just want to get rid of that, all that oxidized portion there. Now you see this, how uneven this part of it is. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and try to get some of the same thickness across the whole flat. Looks fairly good. Like the unevenness is going to come from the fat here. The fat cap on a brisket, this part probably has thick fat in the middle, not much fat, and then on this side you're gonna have a lot of fat. A lot of fat, not much right here in the middle, a lot over here on the side. That's across all briskets. That's how it is. This is it. We got all the trimming done that we want. I'm not going to remove all of the silver skin on here. This silver skin is not tough enough. It's not like the membrane on ribs where you're still going to taste it at the end. All right, so you don't got to mess with the silver skin. This is as much trim as I'm going to do, and just, you know, rub your hand over it until the brisket starts to complain. All right, when I'm seasoning up my brisket, whether for dry brine or just regular, I always start with the edges first. So the rub that I have made here, it already has a binder in there. All right, it's called the salt. That's gonna allow the rub to stick to the meat. And then after the edges, I go and hit the fat cap. Now the fat is not gonna absorb any salt, and you can tell by when you are done with your dry brine, you go and you look at both sides, and you'll see that there usually is no salt on the meat side, but there's all the salt is still going to be on the fat side. This is a thick piece of meat, so don't be afraid to season it. I'm looking at the timer on my phone, and I can tell you that this took me 19 minutes and now 20 seconds. Okay, this is not the worst process at all, but when you season now with your SPG, you don't need to add anything else when it's time to cook. So this takes that extra prep out of your process. And I'm ready to cook the brisket. This comes straight out of the refrigerator and goes into my smoker that's running at about 225, 250. I do not let it come up to room temp. That's not how I do it. I prefer to put a cold slab of brisket onto the smoker.